Hello everyone, greetings from Michigan. Welcome to Busting Millennial Myths and How to Get the Performance Improvement You Need. Trust me, I'm a millennial. My name is Laura Volpaggio and I'll be your moderator. Alex and I are thrilled you could join us today and we have a great presentation on tap for you. Today, Alex, a real-life millennial, is going to dispel some myths about her generation and what can be done to get the performance you've been seeking, as well as prove that not all millennials are alike. For those of you new to ILG, I'm going to give a brief overview to add to the slide. ILG designs and develops custom learning and performance support solutions, and we've been in business for about 13 years. But many on our team have been creating learning solutions a lot longer. What we really care about and what differentiates us is our focus on performance and helping organizations reach their business goals. For us, it's always about performance first. We work with a diverse group of medium and large-sized companies all across the country, some of which we also serve on a global basis. Overall, we have more than 130 clients across 35 industries, with more than half of our work being outside of Michigan. Alex is a project coordinator and instructional designer here at ILG, and as I mentioned earlier, she's also a millennial. Alex joined ILG in 2016 after spending 3 years at FCA, where she designed human resources related e-learning and facilitated plant manager training. Alex has a bachelor's degree in human resources development and a master's in training and organizational development. Alex was a guest on the very first episode of our podcast, Learning Trends Beyond the Buzz, where she gave her insight on millennials and the modern learner. It is a true delight to be working with Alex, and I can say she definitely doesn't fit the mold of the typical millennial. And now, Alex, let's bust some of those myths.
All right, thank you, Laura, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. So before we get started, I'd just like to hear why you joined us. Did you hope to learn more about millennials, learn how to improve performance, or maybe just to learn that millennials aren't as awful as you thought? So go ahead and answer the poll on screen. All right, so it looks like the majority of you are interested. Oh, we got a tie. Results are changing. So kind of all across the board here, we want to learn more about millennials, learn how to improve performance, and then prove that millennials aren't awful. So good news, you're going to gain insight on all of these things today in this webinar. All right, so there's 40 million millennials currently in the workplace, and if you Google millennial, you're going to get hundreds of articles about how terrible we are. On the surface, there's really very few publications about our positive qualities, and this negative mentality surrounding the millennial generation seems to be a trend. So I thought it would be fun to survey my colleagues. I asked them what word immediately comes to mind when you think of millennials, and these are some of their responses. The first was fast, as in the speed, spoiled, social media, job hopping, which is a pretty common one, weak. I wasn't necessarily sure what they meant about that. We got impulsive, not loyal, which is another common millennial myth, tech savvy, cell phones, just cell phones all on their own, not prejudiced, which was perhaps the only positive quality that I had someone say, finally a positive response, and then my personal favorite, thick-rimmed glasses, which you will be interested to find out that I do actually wear thick-rimmed glasses, so I'm not sure if that's where they got that from or not. But as you can see just from this small little survey that I did in my organization, the reaction in the news, online, and even in our own workplaces is all the same. But why? Why is this the immediate reaction to millennials? So just to give you a quick look at one millennial in more detail, this is a little bit about me. I'm Alex Morgen, as we've already said. I was born in 1991, which puts me at 26 years old and right smack dab in the middle of the millennial category. I always got a participation ribbon growing up, dance competitions, spelling bees, the science fair, you name it, I for sure got a participation ribbon for it. My mom and dad paid for my bachelor's degree, something that I'm very thankful for. I own an iPhone, an iPad, a MacBook, an iMac, Beats wireless headphones, a couple Apple TVs. I'm sure I could continue on, but I think you get the point there. I absolutely love to be told good job. It's like music to my ears, and I think my coworkers here at ILG could attest to that. And then I also love to binge watch Netflix. But on surface level, I look pretty awful. But if you dig a little deeper, there's a lot more to learn about me. Thank goodness. I got my first summer job in 2007 while I was still in high school, and I haven't stopped working since. I learned the value of $1 pretty early on, and it was important to me to earn my own money. I hated those stinking participation ribbons, and it always made me extremely frustrated with myself for not getting first place. And all I wanted to know really was what I needed to do to get an actual ribbon or a first place trophy the next time. My parents did pay for my bachelor's degree, yes, but I also worked 2 jobs during undergrad to save up enough to pay for my own master's degree. And I obtained that degree while working in a full-time HR role at FCA. I grew up with technology, and yes, I have more, technology items than we could name, but I use all of these forms of technology to check my work email after hours and on the weekends, and I also use them to keep up to date on world news and to read articles related to my field. Feedback is super important to me, good or constructive, so I just want to know where I stand in my organization and how I'm performing. If I'm not doing well, I want to know what I need to do to improve, and being told good job is just some reassurance that I'm on the right track. And along with the Netflix, there's no excuses there. I do love to binge watch Netflix, but I don't think that that's just a millennial thing. So just a little bit about me. I'm only one data point, but I don't fit this typical millennial mold, and I think that that's the case more often than not. We often focus on what's on the surface of the generation instead of looking at the complex layers of people. So let's bust some of these common myths. Today we're just going to look at 5 in more detail and why they aren't necessarily true. So the first one is that we are the job hopping generation. Have any of you witnessed this personally in your organization? Would you yourself describe millennials as a job hopper? Go ahead and use the chat box and share some of your feedback. And so I actually recently watched a viral video of Simon Sinek, and in it he's talking about millennials. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. And in the video he says that anything that you want, you can have instantly now. There's instant gratification or response for every single thing in life except for 2 things. The first is job satisfaction, and the second is meaningful relationships. And this really frustrates millennials. And I think this quote is so great because what he's really saying here is that millennials desire to have job satisfaction, and when they don't have that, they're super frustrated. Oh, it looks like, Jana, thank you for sharing. So Jana is a millennial, and most jobs that she's had were 1 to 2 years, but they were career-building stops, and she's been in her current job for 6 years. And I think that's a great example. We're actually going to cover that exact same kind of path that you followed there in the presentation. So thanks so much for sharing that. So, but why do millennials leave when they don't have job satisfaction? Well, millennials came of age during the recession. We witnessed instability in the workplace, tons of business scandals, our parents' jobs being downsized. So we're really looking for that stability. And then millennials also want growth opportunities, even if that means growing right out of the company that we're currently working for. And so that might be the case for Jana, where she was working for companies, she felt like she could grow, and she left to go to a new company. But loyalty depends really on the opportunities that millennials are afforded in a company, and then also the cultural fit. So millennials really aren't job hopping because they're bored or they're not loyal or can't commit. They're really just looking for a job that's the right fit, and then once they find it and can see their growth opportunities, they're likely to stay. Just like in Jana's example, she's been at her current position for 6 years. So that tied perfectly into what we're talking about. So I think it's safe to say that that is a myth. Millennials are not job hopping and they are not disloyal. If we go into myth 2, we're talking about being addicted to technology and having no social media boundaries. So in my personal experience, this is no longer just a millennial thing. This is totally the way that the world is moving now. My mom is 65 and she has Facebook and Instagram. She calls me sometimes on my way home from work to ask me if I've seen the most recent video that she shared on Facebook, as if that's what I'm doing all day while I'm at work. And then my 95-year-old grandma has an iPhone, and she uses Facebook to keep track of all 50 of her grandkids. My 4-year-old niece can operate my iPad better than I even can. This is just the direction that the world is moving, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think that we need to learn to adapt as an organization. So 85% of millennials have smartphones. And honestly, the only shocking thing to me about that is that 15% of them don't have a smartphone. We don't remember a world without technology. We see it as an enhancement to workplace efficiency. So why would I do something manually when there's an app for that? Or why would I go to a full-day workshop when I can learn how to do it by watching a 2-minute YouTube video? And then most importantly, I think, is that 5 out of 6 millennials use social media to find and connect with potential employers, which means if your company that you're working for isn't on social media promoting jobs, you're really missing out on 5 out of 6 potential candidates for your open positions, which is huge. So I think we need to really learn how to use this to our advantage. So that is myth number 2 busted. Myth number 3 is that we have an attitude of entitlement. In other words, we are the participation ribbon generation. Millennials love to learn, and I think that we have a desire to constantly get better. 69% of millennials see their annual performance review process as flawed because they don't have a leader giving them feedback on a regular basis. So they're only hearing about their performance once a year, maybe twice a year. And research shows that millennials really want a leader who coaches them and gives them both positive and constructive feedback, not a boss that's just telling them what to do on a daily basis. So think of it this way. This is kind of my favorite analogy to use when we're talking about entitlement. I can go as a millennial and post something to Facebook and know almost immediately whether or not people like it, love it, dislike it, agree with me, but I turn an assignment into work, and this is not a reflection of my current workplace, but a lot of millennials are experiencing this. They turn an assignment into their supervisor, and then they wait an entire year through their performance review process to hear anything about it. So no wonder they're entitled, because they only get negative feedback once a year, or less in some cases, and even then they still usually get a performance bonus. And giving a monetary incentive to a poor performing employee is really the exact same thing as giving a participation ribbon to the losing t-ball team. You're essentially rewarding employees for showing up, which creates an entitlement attitude. So maybe we need to look at our processes as an organization and not at the millennial generation.
Looks like, Alex, we have some comments from Michelle and Donna.
All right, so Michelle, this generation is more defensive of critical feedback. They may want feedback, but they tend to overreact when you give them negative feedback. That's a very good point, Michelle, and without further information, I wouldn't be able to comment on that specific instance, but I do think that some of the responsibility does obviously rely on the person that's receiving the feedback. It's important to be able to give feedback, constructive and positive, as well as be able to receive it. So I think that's a great comment to make. And then Donna, wanting growth opportunities in their jobs is not necessarily a millennial-specific thing. I'm a boomer, and I wanted growth opportunities when I was early in my career. Who doesn't want that? I think that's totally a great point, Donna. I mean, that's kind of the point that we're getting at here, is a lot of these myths, we're really focusing on the millennial generation, and if you look at the news and the media and articles, it's saying that millennials want all of these things. But I think every time a new generation comes along, we're going to be saying the same exact thing about the next generation. And really, we're all looking for the same type of opportunities. So that's a great point. All right, so let's move on to myth number 4. And this is the myth that frustrates me the absolute most, is that millennials are lazy. So, I mean, this is super easy to bust. 63% of millennials have a bachelor's degree, which makes them the most educated generation in our entire history. And millennials believe in continuously improving their skill set even after landing a new job, which often leads to higher education like master's degrees, PhDs, training certifications at work, and some millennials will even work 2 or more jobs just to pay for these extra learning opportunities. So I think that true research shows that millennials are actually the exact opposite of lazy based on their work ethic and their educational records. So, busted. We are not lazy. And then myth number 5, we can be lumped into one category. So we are talking about a group of 80+ million people here. 43% of us are non-white, and a quarter speak a language other than English at home, which makes us the most diverse generation in history too. And by 2018, millennials will have the most spending power of all of the generations. And we're sitting here busy labeling them instead of learning how to target them and making them comfortable in our organizations. So really, I think the moral of the story here is that millennials really cannot be lumped into one category. And when we look at some of our pain points in HR or training and development or just in organization as a whole, it really becomes much less of a millennial issue because what we're really looking at is how do we improve employee performance. Busted. So now that you've seen the 5 most common myths according to my research surrounding millennials, let's just do a quick poll. So which of these do you think are either displayed or talked about most often in your workplace? Wow. Okay, so it looks like definitely the highest rating is entitlement attitude. And so I think that's super interesting. I mean, we've got some answers in job hoppers, social media, and lazy, but by a landslide, entitlement attitude is number 1. So I think that's super interesting. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I think that we're going to talk about some things in the second half of the presentation that might help you look at that a little bit differently. All right, so we've talked about the millennial myths, but now it's time to focus more on what the real problem is and what we can do to fix it. So let's start talking about the performance improvement that you actually need in your organization. And one way to look at this is to use the performance improvement model. So for the balance of the webinar, we're going to talk about this particular model, Thomas F. Gilbert's performance improvement model. Gilbert was really the founder of performance improvement back in the 60s, and his model can be applied in many situations. This is really one of my favorite models, and if it were up to me, honestly, I think every MBA student, every parent, every wife or husband would learn this model because it can be helpful in many situations, not just at work. So before we get started into the model, let's make sure that we have a shared understanding of what we mean by performance. So when we refer to performance, what we're really talking about is activity plus results. So what is activity? These are some examples on screen, so answering a phone, making a sales call, or training data entry people. If it's not observable, it's not an activity. So we could come up with several examples here. This is just a few. But what do we really care about? Activity is great, but what we really care about is results. So what do we mean by results? A result is really a work accomplishment or completed work that is valuable to the receiver. So things such as reduced costs, increased income, reduced cycle time. I mean, we could come up with a huge list based off examples from all of your organizations of results that we might be looking for. So let's look at a few examples. If the activity is answering the phone, great, but what we really care about is resolving the customer problem. That's really the goal of answering the phone. If making a sales call is the activity, what we really care about is getting that appointment on the calendar with a potential customer or making the actual sale right. And if the activity is training data entry people, the performance result would be fewer help desk calls, or at least we hope so. So these are just a few of an endless amount of scenarios where you could compare activities to the actual performance or result. So now that we understand the difference between activity and performance, let's get back to actual Gilberts model. This model will help us look for the root cause of a performance issue. So today, we'll look at the questions that will actually help you to use the model to do that. So what happens if you get the wrong root cause? Well, usually you would select the wrong solution. So if you look at an example, you think the reason a person in your organization is not using the computer well is because she doesn't know how to use the software. So you say, okay, I'm going to send her to training to learn how to use the software. But what you find out later is that the computer is super old. It doesn't have enough memory. There's outdated versions of the software that she's supposed to use. So now you've spent time and money and pulled her off the job to send her to training, and really you should have spent the money on new hardware and software. Another example, your significant other is not taking out the garbage, or your roommate, for those of you with the roommate. So you create a sign, and every Wednesday night you put the sign on the back door reminding them to take out the garbage, but still no luck. What you find out later is that the cans are too heavy, and what would have really helped them is to buy a cart to help them take out the cans. The last example, and this is perhaps my favorite, this is really, right root cause, right solution, or wrong and wrong solution is really similar to going to the doctors and the doctor diagnosing a patient. It's really important that the doctor takes the time needed to uncover the root cause of your problem. So when we go to our doctor, we expect them to ask the right questions, test the right things, and make an accurate diagnosis so that they can prescribe the right type of medicine or treatment to help us get better. Your organizational leaders are really looking for the same thing from you when they come to you for help with their performance improvement needs. So I'd love to hear if any of you have an example of where you selected the wrong solution to resolve a performance problem, or even where the wrong solution might have been selected for you. So perhaps you were sent to training for something that couldn't be solved with training. So go ahead and type your examples in the chat box. And I'll give you a couple seconds. All right, so Jana, developing hours of live hands-on Excel training only to find out our staff are Googling to find trainings when needed. I think that is an excellent example. Something, here at ILG, luckily the wrong solution was never selected, but it's very similar to that. When I am trying to learn a new development tool, so if I'm working in Articulate or Adapt and I get stuck on something and I have a question, I don't get sent to training. I just typically type it in Google, or I look at YouTube, or I look at some of the helplines for Articulate, and I'm usually able to solve my problem in a couple of minutes. So I can see how that would be a huge waste of time sending people to live hands-on Excel training when they're just Googling it to figure out how to do what they need. So thanks for sharing that example. All right, so this slide shows the actual Gilberts model, and what you see are basically 2 rows, or a total of 6 cells or boxes. And note that the top row is called environment and the bottom row is called individual, which I'm going to explain on the next slide. What we're going to do for the rest of the session is talk about each individual cell and introduce you to 6 questions that you can ask in order to determine why performance is out of whack in your organization, or at home, whichever you choose. And I'll also give you possible solutions for each out of the 6 out of whack areas. So if you want to follow along, this model is actually on page 1 of the handout that was provided, and the questions associated with each box are on page 2 of the handout. But before we dive into the 6 questions, let's introduce one more concept. So this slide has 2 symbols. The light bulb on the left stands for environment. So of the 6 questions that we'll look at today, 3 are about things going on in the environment. And what we mean are things that the managers or HR, training and development, really the organization, can control about the employee's surroundings. The other symbol on the right represents the individual. So the other 3 out of the 6 questions that we'll look at today are about things going on with the individual. In other words, what each person brings with them to the job. So our computer example about sending the person to training rather than buying a new computer, that's environment. The computer is part of the environment. In the garbage can example, it's also environmental in the way that we phrased it, but it could be individual. So for example, if my husband has a lack of motivation to take out the trash, it doesn't matter how many signs I create, that's an individual issue, not environmental. So let's dive in. All right, so here we go. Let's take a look at our first question and notice that there is a light bulb on this slide. So this question has to do with the environment, and this cell is actually about expectations and feedback. So the first question is, are expectations for performance clear? In other words, does the person know what he or she is supposed to be doing? So if we look at an example, let's say that a person in your organization is continuously turning in their expense report late. They may need to just have a manager tell them the monthly due date because they didn't know, and it's probably not necessary to send someone to 2 days of expense report training. Now let's look at the second question on the slide. Is relevant and frequent feedback provided? So does the individual know how they're doing? The individual took the action, but do they know if it was done correctly? This is where feedback comes in. So in our earlier example, does the person actually know he's turning in his expense report late, or has nobody ever even told him that? So if you ask yourself these 2 questions and the answer is no, he doesn't know what is expected, and no, he doesn't know how well he did, then what do you think are some of the possible solutions? So I'd love for you to share in the chat box if you can think of any potential solutions for an expectation or a feedback problem. All right, so here's some solutions on this slide. We've got communication, so just a simple one-on-one meeting, a department meeting with the staff if it's a larger issue and there's a lot of people turning in their expense reports late, or something posted on the internet. You could have an orientation to set expectations, or this is how we do things here. Looks like we do have a response from Donna for an expectation problem, set expectations.
I think that's perfect,
That's
Donna.
so perfect, Donna. I mean, right? Exactly. So, and that's kind of like our second example. You have an orientation, you set the expectations so that everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing. You could also use an employee handbook that lays out the expectations so that the employees have something they can continuously refer back to. Having policies and procedures is super important, which are at a more detailed level, obviously, but that way the employee knows what's expected. And then also a business plan at a much higher level, which lays out the company's goals and strategies so that people know what they're working toward. So these all address whether or not expectations are clear, but what about feedback? So you could have a quarterly staff meeting, an end-of-year report, a performance review, which is pretty common in large organizations, provide a job description so that they know exactly what fits within the footprint of their job, or having an informal feedback conversation, which I think is the most important. And that list could go on. I mean, there's plenty of solutions for not having feedback or expectations set clearly. So if we move on to question 2, we're still talking about the environment, which you can see by the light bulb, and this box is about tools, resources, time, and materials. So the question here is really, are sufficient tools, resources, time, and materials available for your employees? So do people have the stuff they need to do their job well? An example of a tool could be a drill press, an instrument for a musician, can't really play the guitar if you don't have a guitar, a computer if you need a computer at work. That list could go on. Resources could be anything such as a product manual or a user guide for computer software. Time is perhaps the most difficult typically for people to kind of get a handle on, but an associate at a store or a bank teller at a bank on a Friday at noon, the line could be a mile long. So it's really not that the individual isn't performing well in most cases, it's that the bank might not be staffed right. So time in that example would be a resource. Another example for time is a manufacturing line. So say an hourly associate has 45 seconds to attach their part in the footprint of their job. And then the supplier changes the part attachment, and now it takes them 60 seconds to attach the part accurately. It doesn't matter how well that associate knows how to do their job, they're not going to be able to perform a 60-second job in 45 seconds. So time would be a resource in that case. And then the last one, materials, could be like the handout that we provided for today's session, that's a material. Ingredients for a cake, if you're baking and you're missing butter, you're not going to be able to make a cake. And some supplier items on the assembly line. So if the employee is supposed to be attaching something to the motor and the item isn't there, obviously that's a lack of materials. So if the answer to this question is no, they're missing one of these things. So some possible solutions here include templates. So for the expense report example, do they have a template to start from, or are we asking our employees to do their expense report from scratch? Because that could take a longer amount of time and then in return cause them to turn it in late. Reference manuals, so don't send an employee to training to memorize something that could make a lot more sense in a reference manual. If anything, you might want to teach them how to use the manual or look up things. Process maps is another option, so providing a path and giving them the step-by-step for how to complete the job. The appropriate number of hours or people, so this is like the store or bank example. Do they actually have enough time or hours in the day to perform the tasks that you're asking them to perform? Online help or a good user guide instead of sending them to a complete training. So that's kind of similar to Jana's Excel training example. Is there some type of online help that we could provide them as a company so that they don't have to go Google it, but we've got an online resource already developed for them that's quick and it's short and they can look up exactly what they need. And then business equipment, so the right version of software, a working computer and phone, the right kind of chair, lights so you can see the papers on your desk. So the list there could go on. And then the last environmental question is question 3, and this is all about rewards and recognition. So are adequate financial incentives available, and are they based on the employee's performance? Are non-monetary incentives available? Are career development opportunities provided? So any of our millennial myths ring a bell there. Millennials are looking for development opportunities. Are we providing a clear career path for them? And are there clear consequences for poor performance? So this box basically addresses money, praise, and advancement or career growth. So really that extrinsic motivation. So some potential solutions here include a compensation strategy, but the key there is that it's transparent so that the employees know what to expect. Because having a compensation strategy that's not shared, it makes it difficult for employees to understand the decisions you're making. A benefits strategy, informal recognition when employees do well in their job, and clearly communicated career paths, which is a huge one for millennials. So what I think is really important here for the solutions in box 3 is that the alignment between what employees are asked to do and what they're being rewarded for. So what really matters is that you engineer the compensation and other awards to align to what you're asking employees to do. And you really need to be on the lookout, or we all do, for the misalignment where you ask employees to do one thing, but then you're paying them to do something different. So a couple examples of that, you have a customer service representative that you send to training, and in the training you tell them, take your time with customers, paraphrase what they say, be empathetic. But then you're paying the customer service reps based on calls completed per day. That's pretty conflicting. Or another example, you have a sales associate that you want to build appropriate profit margins into the price, but then you compensate that associate based on gross sale. So with these examples, all you've really done is confuse the employee by setting up conflicting recognition. So in box 3, you just have to be very careful about the alignment. So before we move on, we've finished all of the environmental questions. I just want to pause and ask if you have any questions about the first row. So you can go ahead and use the chat box and I'll move on, but if we see a question, we will pause. So why do we have an 80% on this slide? What do you think this means? And you can also go ahead and type this answer into the chat box if you think you know what the 80% means. Based on the research and our personal experience at ILG, 80% of the problems in the workplace are caused by the environment, or this top row of boxes and the questions that we just covered. So it's not the individuals or the employees. Good, but also scary, because what that means is that your job as a manager or as an HR professional or training and development is that you need to engineer the environment so that you're addressing these 3 questions. And obviously some of these you have more or less control of depending on your organization and your role. But really, this means that maybe we should stop focusing on millennials and the generational differences and really be focusing on the environment that we're providing for our employees. So before we move on to the bottom row of Gilberts and the individual questions, let's just do a simple example that we can all relate to. So we'll use this model to figure out why employees aren't accurately completing their time reports in a timely manner. Just a super easy, simple example. So I like to go through the model systematically instead of jumping around. So if we start with question 1, what are some questions that we could ask to understand why employees are not turning in time reports on time? Does anyone have an example question to ask for expectations and feedback? All right, so we've got a question. Do you know when it is due? That's great. Do they know when they're supposed to complete their time report by? Have they been given constructive feedback when they haven't turned in their time report on time?
Oh, so we've got another one.
We've got another example. Has finance set a deadline, for example, within 1 week for expense reports to be submitted? That's great. Exactly. So is there a deadline? Do they know when they're supposed to turn it in by? Question number 2, do they have a template with formulas to use to complete their time report? Is there a system that they use to submit it? So that would be a tools and resources question to ask. In question number 3, we're talking about incentives here. So is there a consequence? What happens if the employees don't turn in their time report on time? Do they not get paid? Probably unlikely, but that would be a consequence that would, encourage people to turn their time reports in on time. So these are just simple examples of the types of questions that you would ask for a specific problem in order to get to the root cause. All right, so let's move on to the individual. So you see the symbol in the right corner of the screen, and this box addresses skills and knowledge. So are adequate knowledge and skills present? When we say knowledge, think of facts, so list the 10 presidents, something like that. And a skill is really something that you can observe a person doing, so building a cabinet or attaching a wire harness to a car motor. So how do you know if a person has adequate skills or knowledge is the hard part. And I like to say if the person's life depended on it, can they do the actual thing? So if their life depended on it, can they list the 10 presidents or build the cabinet? If they can do it, but they just don't do it, that's not a lack of skill or knowledge, which is how we as organizations can fall into the trap of conducting training for the wrong reasons. So they can do it, but they're not, and we send them to training. That's not going to fix the issue. So if the person truly does lack skill or knowledge, so you've determined that if their life depended on it, they cannot do the thing, then that's where training or informal learning opportunities are truly the right solution. So just to clarify, when we say training, we mean the more formal training solutions such as an instructor-led training course, a 60-minute e-learning module, and when we say informal learning, we're referring to job aids, SOPs or standard operating procedures, and user guides. So let's go back to my assembly line example. If an associate in an automotive manufacturing facility works on the motor line and they're attaching wire harnesses to the motor, and they consistently attach the harness incorrectly, training or an informal learning opportunity would be a great solution, but you would have to rule out that if their life depended on it, they couldn't complete the task. So perhaps the wire harness supplier changed the attach mechanism and the employee no longer knows how to complete the task accurately. So that would be a great example of where training or informal learning would be the right solution. So in summary to this question number 4, training is a wonderful solution if it's truly a knowledge and skill deficit. But you have to be careful that you don't think training will fix everything, which I think a lot of organizations can fall into that trap. So we like to say at ILG, there's times where you can train until you're blue in the face, but nothing is going to change back on the job if it's not the right solution. And training is an expensive solution, so as managers, you just have to be careful that you look at all the performance factors before you jump to training as the answer. All right, question number 5. This is an individual question, and here we're talking about physical and mental capabilities. So are adequate physical and mental capabilities present? In other words, physical, are they strong enough to do the job, or can they complete the job physically? And mental, do they have a high enough IQ? So if you have someone on an assembly line again who has to inspect for the correct color, and you hire a person that's colorblind, they won't be able to perform the job well. Or, in the wire harness example, if the wire harness weighs 50 pounds and the employee can't lift more than 35, they're probably not going to perform that job well. Regarding the mental capacity, you should ask yourself, does the person have the IQ to perform this job? So most likely, a person with an IQ of 40 will never perform well as a brain surgeon. You could send them to training over and over forever, but that's not going to make them perform brain surgery well if their IQ remains at 40. So really the best solution for physical and mental capabilities is the right job selection. So it really has to do with getting the right person in the right job. Selection and job fit have to do with hiring the right person or doing an internal transfer that makes the most sense. So before you move the 90-pound person to the shipping department, consider physical or mental capabilities if that's the case. And you may be wondering about the last solution, which is job design. There may be times where you can split up a job and give some tasks to one person and other tasks to another. There's many jobs in manufacturing actually where 2 people lift one item together because it's too heavy for one person to lift, so they need 2. And companies now, I think a lot of companies include a physical and mental requirement statement in their job descriptions when they're hiring for this exact reason. And I actually know of some companies who conduct tests. So you might have to pass a certain test in order to get the job or pass a physical test in order to get the job. And then the last box, this box is about the desire to perform, so that true intrinsic motivation. The third box on the top row was about that extrinsic motivation, so what we are providing them to motivate, but this is really intrinsic. So does the individual want to do the job? They might have the knowledge and skill to do the job and the physical and mental capacity, but maybe they don't like anything about the job or the task. So when I've interviewed people in the past, I like to spend a lot of time trying to determine if they really want the job, if they're excited about it, in addition to having the right knowledge and skills. So an example, you could imagine that a person has the training and IQ to be a surgeon, but they get really excited about spending time with patients when they're awake and not under anesthesia, and talking with them, educating them, caring for them. So that person might better serve as a nurse than a surgeon, simply based on their career aspirations and their desires. And in our field, there are people that train, there are people that do like what you're seeing me do today, present, there are people that write training materials, develop e-learning. So a person may love doing one of these jobs and absolutely hate doing the other, but they could technically have the skills to do all of them. So it's really about that intrinsic motivation to perform the job. So the solution here You guessed it, they're exactly the same as question number 5. So again, it's really about getting the right person in the right job. So job fit is the solution here. So if we go back to our case study, we want to know why our employees are not completing their timesheet correctly or completing it on time. So for question number 4, skills and knowledge, what types of questions could we ask in order to get to the root cause of whether or not they have the skill or knowledge to complete the expense report on time? Go ahead and use the chat box. All right, so do they know how to find and use the template? That's good. So do they have the skills necessary to complete the report? Do they know how to use it? We've determined that they have the template, but we would need to know if they know how to use it. So that's great, Donna. And do they know how to use the computer in general? I mean, that's kind of a silly question, but you never know. If we're really trying to get to the root cause, maybe they just got a new laptop and they can't figure out how to even use the computer. That would cause them to turn in their expense report late. For question number 5, can they see the template or the keyboard? Can they see their screen? So maybe they need a lift for their screen to see the small Excel boxes better. Do they have the mental capacity to use Excel as a program? I do have the mental capacity, but I do find it very difficult to use Excel in some cases, so that could be an issue for them if the template is not easy to use. And then question number 6, do they even care about completing their time report on time? Does it matter to them whether or not they get paid? It just might be one of those things that's on the last of their to-do list and they're really not worried about it. So again, you could complete any type of case study or example where you pick a common performance problem in your organization and you walk through these 6 questions, super simple, and ask yourself the questions that align with the problem to get to the root cause of the issue. So that's Gilberts Performance Improvement Model, and by asking yourself these 6 questions about your employees, you can get to the root cause of performance issues and hopefully improve performance in your organization by applying some of the solutions we discussed. Now, you might have noticed that we didn't really talk a whole ton about millennials in the second half of the presentation, and that's because millennial or not, you can discover the root cause of performance issues in the same way. If the goal is to just improve performance, Gilberts is a model that can be used regardless of generational differences. So I think we really need to stop focusing on why millennials are different or why any of the generations are different, and instead focus on why our people aren't performing to their full potential. So I've got one last poll before we conclude. I'd love to hear what keeps you up at night, maybe as an HR professional, a manager, or a training and development professional. Which of these common problems gives you the most grief? All right, so we got a pretty high response in performance gaps, managing generational expectations. We just got a couple of more answers in recruiting and retention, which is also tied with millennials. 0% in developing leaders, which I find is interesting, but also good that we don't have that problem. That's awesome. Okay, so what I like to say about this, and those are some great results, and what's nice is that you can use Gilberts to resolve or get to the root cause of all of those issues. It's a useful tool for all of these common issues. So, for example, recruiting and retention. If you have the right job fit for a recruit and you hire the right person, and then once they're hired, you provide them the tools and the resources and the incentives that they need to do the job, and then you give them feedback when they're not performing the job well, or positive feedback when they are, and you provide them training when they need it, they're pretty likely to be retained because they've got these growth opportunities, they have the tools that they need. So that's a great way to get to the root cause of that issue. If you move on to performance gaps, you can close performance gaps by getting to the root cause of the performance issue by using all of these 6 questions. So that's a lot of what we talked about today. You can develop leaders, although that wasn't something that we seem to have a problem with. You could still use this model to develop leaders if they're given the right training to help them get to the next level. Do they have the intrinsic and the extrinsic motivation to excel? Are they providing good feedback, and are they receiving constructive feedback well, which is another comment that we made about millennials, that they're not receiving that feedback well. So that's actually something that they could be coached on. And then managing generational expectations. Are we addressing the top row of environmental factors? If not, I think that's a great way to root cause that issue. And then I think all 5 of the millennial myths we discussed were busted within these 6 questions. So hopefully this presentation helps you sleep a little better at night, knowing that some of these common problems that give you grief can be root caused using this performance improvement model. So thank you all so much for your time today. Does anyone have any questions before we wrap up? I have seen reports that talked about millennials that have been used to personal training, tutors, and personal coaches, so very individualized instruction. This will challenge the traditional formal performance evaluation process and enabling formalized mentoring and coaching programs. I think that's a great example. Millennials especially, but I think all people prefer to have a coach and a mentor, someone that's guiding them and giving them feedback along the way. So it definitely does challenge the traditional and old school format of performance evaluation, which is I think why a lot of millennials are unhappy with certain companies, because they feel they only get reviewed one time a year and it's not an adequate way to develop their skills. So thanks for sharing that, Jason. All right, well, I'm going to turn the session back over to Laura so she can wrap us up, but feel free to put in any last minute questions.
Oh, looks like we have one.
Oh.
Please comment.
One of the current learning trends toward personalization of learning, so we all have to deal with that issue.
Yeah, personalization. I've heard a lot about that there. We're going to be doing a podcast on the personalization and how it affects how individualizing the trainings for everyone in the different generations.
It's very true, and a lot of organizations are actually using social media in order to help personalize learning and, you know, having a dashboard where people can interact with each other and collaborate. So I think that's huge.
Hey, thanks, Donna. All right, looks like that's it for questions. Thank you, Alex. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Alex's contact information is on the screen, so please reach out with any additional questions, thoughts, or further comments. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have a new podcast series called Learning Trends Beyond the Buzz. Each episode touches on the latest in learning trends and methods facing the industry today. We've included a link to the episodes on this slide. Right now, so far, we have some interesting podcasts on the modern learner, micro-learning, and learning portals. And our next one coming up will be on storytelling, so I hope you take a moment to listen and get some insight on those topics. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.